So with that said, at this point, again, really, in having talked through the different telephony connectivity options available as we think about Teams Voice, further what that means specifically to calling plans, direct routing, and operator connects. Next, I'm going to briefly talk to an equally important consideration, which applies to any connectivity option you choose. And this is really under the guise of dynamic 911 emergency calling instead. So a couple of things to note, more than just planning out, which design or connectivity path you may choose to move forward with from a Teams Voice perspective. Equally important, is you'll need to do some discovery and planning up front with your internal. Typically, you will see like either corporate, legal, or regulatory leads to understand what is your emergency response obligation. And part of that will further influence how we need to configure the team service to support that broader, dynamic notification emergency response requirement. Feeding into that, depending on which PS10 connectivity option you choose to proceed forward with, and again, you can choose a particular option, or similarly, you can mix and match instead. But the key there is there will be some additional policies that you'll have to configure supporting 911, such that when someone does place an emergency call, and again, this doesn't have to apply just to the U.S. This could also accrue to other locations, rest of the world instead. But the key there is, again, based on the telephony connection option selected, the locale, and what that emergency response requirement needs to be, and there will be additional policies within the service that you'll have to define to make sure that the right requirements are met. And again, we'll talk through each of these a little bit further. Supporting that, high level from a U.S. perspective, over the last couple of years has been some of the updated guidance specific to Kerry's Law and Raybaum's Act. And really the key there is being able to provide as close as possible a current location for emergency response coordination. Second to that is notification. So meaning if someone does place an emergency call, the right persons have to be notified. And then thirdly, there can't be a blocking access code in place. So think about, for example, not having to dial 9 first to access an outside line, meaning I have to be able to dial 911 directly, and that routing of that call should always be able to egress externally instead. Now, one thing to note is those core requirements are kind of the base level from a governmental federal point of view. But as part of that internal analysis with your internal corporate and legal teams, they'll further need to determine what those requirements need to be per state, even in some cases per municipality or at the city level, because there may be additional restrictions there you have to account for that will factor into your overall design. So as an example, in some states or some cities, based on the square foot size of the building, may differentiate if you only have to provide the default physical address, or do you need to go further beyond just the physical address to denote the floor of the building or the room of the floor instead. So again, the key there, reviewing those requirements upfront with your legal team will pay accolades forward as you look to finalize, the requirements necessary, not only for Teams Voice, but as we think about for regulation for emergency response. The way this will then come together at a high level, so assuming we've got kind of that foundation up front, is supporting dynamic emergency calling. It's really comprised of the four boxed areas you see blue at top here. And the way that this will summarize up front is first and foremost, you need to identify what are those trusted public-facing IP addresses or subnets that represent those corporate segments across your organization. So the key here is if I'm at an office location, I launch my Teams client. What is that public-facing IP address that the service will see at that point? So that's kind of step one. And again, important to note is that that trusted IP or IP address subnet can represent either IP version 4 or IP version 6. And in this case, we support both. Second to that, then, is there will be additional configuration required with what we refer to as the Location Information Service database. What this will further comprise of is you'll have to enter in the different physical address locations, which will include geo coordinates, again, for all the corporate sites that you need to provide emergency response coordination for. And then additionally, based on those unique locale requirements, again, we kind of mentioned earlier, there may be further considerations at the region, state, municipality, or city level instead. So supporting that, that's where you'll need to further define specific details around subnet, BSSID for wireless access point. Again, that may cover a particular floor or a particular area of the building, or further if needed, the MAC address of the switch or the MAC address of the switch port instead. So again, the key there, lots of flexibility available based upon how that location database needs to be defined. The third piece to that then is the emergency policies in that light. And so the two core policies supporting first has to do with notification. So what this will allow is that if a user places an emergency call, you can identify who gets notified. That could be a user group or groups. Secondly, you could also have as an option to conference in an external phone number when an emergency call is placed. So if we had a particular security desk, as an example. And then thirdly, there's also another option where you can define a notice banner up front up to, I think it's 250 characters, where every time end users launch the Teams client, you can remind users that they need to confirm their location at that time, before they resume leveraging capabilities of voice in that light. And then second to that, there's also a routing policy that you can define as well. And the second one actually only applies to direct routing specifically. But what this further allows is that if you've got internal short digit extension scenarios that require equal emergency notifications. So as an example, we have seen with some customers, maybe there's an internal number that's dialed for a particular type of emergency response instead. You would program that through the call routing policy, and then you can choose to send that short extension via the PSTN as dialed, or you can translate that to a full E164 number instead. So again, lots of flexibility there. And then further, you can take determination on where that emergency call should be routed. Then the last consideration as we think about configuration and design aspects for emergency calling are the considerations, again, from a policy perspective and how that may apply to a region, site, or segment within a site, which would be a subnet in this case. And so the key here, as you summarize this all together, these are really the core four main building blocks. Again, it really starts with mapping out your public-facing IP space. Second to that, your location database details. Thirdly, how you need to consider your notification and emergency call routing policies if appropriate. Again, the latter there only applies to direct routing. And then lastly, any policy considerations that may further be prescriptive on a region or site or subnet perspective instead. And in that last scenario, what that allows you to do is you say, for example, I work from my normal office site and say I happen to be visiting another site for the week. If I place a call to 911, I wouldn't want to notify maybe the designated persons from my home site by assigning this policy at the site level. I can ensure while I'm traveling abroad that I notify, maybe the security or the team that's supporting that site that's physically located locally instead. So again, lots of flexibility there. To take a little bit dive deeper, then once that core configuration is in place, also key to note is that the way that this will come together is that whenever you launch the Teams client, whether you're on site or if you're working remote, we've got some details on the remote scenario, what we'll talk to here next. The way that this works is that the Teams client will first try to look to see if there's a match based on location, and then further to that, it'll see if there's a more detailed match based on subnet, access point, again associated to the BSSID tied to that access point, or the MAC address of the switch, or the MAC address of the switch port instead. For those last two scenarios where we're matching on MAC address, that's only available for Ethernet connections, and it does have a requirement where we do leverage LLDP to support that specific discovery instead. So the key there, if you have a requirement where you need to match at the switch or the switch port level, that's only supported for Ethernet. And then further, there will be an LLDP enablement requirement to support. And then another final consideration, again, for direct routing specifically, is that if you, I like calling plans where Microsoft will provide the emergency service provider service for you as part of that license and that enablement. For direct routing specifically, this is an additional contractual consideration that you'll have to account for, where basically you'll have to establish as part of your deployment a SIP trunk type connection that terminates into your SBC. But the key here is that just like our list of certified SBC providers, you'll have to leverage one of these certified partners for that emergency routing service instead. So again, it's just another consideration point to factor. With that in mind, then, to talk a little bit further, then, what this means from a hybrid or no-bad or work from home perspective. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, once we've got all these dynamic 911 details configured up front, and again, the way that the client will determine its location is if you're on a corporate site, if there's a location match within your internal database for Teams, that will match directly. And if you place an emergency call, your location and the geo coordinates will be directly passed across. However, if we consider the case where maybe I'm on the go, I'm working from a hotel, or maybe I'm working from home, the way that Teams will determine your location for that scenario instead is there's actually a geolocation service. It's part of the operating system. It's there for Windows. There's one for Mac. This also accrues to mobile devices as well. And the way that this works is that the geolocation service within your tenant will submit your public IP address at that time. And based on your public IP address, the tenant will cross-correlate through a map API the approximate physical address, and again, the approximate geo coordinates that your endpoint in your Teams client is determined to be located. As an end user, again, that detection happens automatically. So as an end user, when working remote, you can choose to confirm if that is correct. The way that will work is if it is accurate, if you place a call for 911 using Teams, even though you are on the go or working from home, you'll get directly routed to the PSAP that is supporting most closest to that location. Alternatively, if the auto-detected address is incorrect and you choose to edit your location instead, the client allows you to update those details, but the difference there is because you're manually defining into the service where your location is in that light. If you do place a call to 911, what will differentiate is you'll go to a screening center first where they'll actually receive that address that you entered, but the first question they're going to ask you is to confirm your location before they reroute you to the piece that most closely supporting. So again, the key there is depending how that hybrid on the go location is detected. If we auto detect it by default and it's accurate, you place an emergency call, you go directly to the PSAP. But if you manually update or edit that location instead, just note that that will differentiate the behavior where when placing an emergency call, you'll actually go through a screening center first. And then supporting that, as I noted earlier, this gives you an example of the optional notification banner that you can also configure. Again, this is defined as part of that emergency calling policy. Again, up to 250 characters in this case, and then the users, every time they launch the Teams client and they go to the call area, that banner will always surface until they select OK. If they close down the Teams client and relaunch it, again, the next time they go to that call area, that banner will display again and choose until they choose OK in that light. And then a few final screenshots just to summarize that emergency call experience is once everything is properly programmed and in place, this gives you an example of how the Teams client will automatically detect an example corporate location. Um, if you do place an emergency call, this gives you kind of an overview of what that experience looks like. You'll notice when the Teams, will get an emergency red circle with exclamation notification. This is the same experience whether you place a call when you're on a corporate site or if you're working remote instead. Part of that notification will include your assigned phone number, and then obviously the part of that as well will be the location details in terms of physical address and geo coordinates, all of that which gets automatically sent across, to the PSAP, public service answering point that is processing that call. And then lastly, from a notification perspective, this also gives you an overview of how this notification would be surfaced in Teams. So as part of that notification policy we talked about earlier, for those persons that you designate, this represents who placed the emergency call and where that emergency call was conducted from. And then finally, this just gives you kind of a similar overview of how this will be represented from a native phone device as well. And again, the key here, you can notice that this is an emergency call. And again, your location details along with geo coordinates will also be provided. And then lastly, again, as part of that notification policy, you have as an option where the persons you designate can only be or only notified in Teams. That's one option. Or beyond getting notified in Teams, you can further choose to have them conferenced in to those emergency calls as well. And again, the key there is you can have them conferenced in muted or unmuted instead. So again, in summary, lots of flexibility there in how Dynamic 911, the routing and the notifications need to be defined. Now, before I transition next into some of the considerations high level as we think about these advanced voice applications, do we have any remaining questions in the chat, Don?